For those of you who missed the news, there is a very nasty lawsuit going on between Stardock Entertainment, the makers of games like Galactic Civilizations, Elemental, and so on, versus the creators behind Star Control, Paul Ritchie and Fred Ford. Now, this dropped last year, with Stardock announcing that they are working on the game Star Control Origins, a sequel to the franchise, thanks to them acquiring, or at the time, thinking that they acquired the IP towards the entire franchise. Following that, Paul and Fred announced that they are working on a spiritual successor called Ghosts of the Precursors, as they don't own the Star Control name anymore. However, the lawsuit has been going to the argument as to who owns the property. Who owns the copyrightable elements of this franchise? Characters, story, aesthetics, stuff like that. And the big news that happened this past week was that Paul and Fred successfully got a DMCA, or Digital Millennium Copyright Act, claim against Stardock. And what that means is that Star Control Origins has been pulled from GOG and Steam. And of course, being pulled from two of the major storefronts is not exactly good for a game that was already not doing so well in the market to begin with. And while the lawsuit is continuing to ramp up, it does present with us another very interesting case to discuss this specific question. Can you copyright game design? And this is a very sticky topic, and as always, let me preface this by saying I am not a lawyer. And I'm sure there are plenty of legal people here on YouTube, Twitter, and so on who can look at things from more of that point of view. But when it comes to game design, this is where things get very tricky, as with any legal issue when it comes to game development. The last time we spoke about this, we talked about fan-made games. Stuff like another Metroid, Pokemon Uranium, Kaizo games, you name it, somebody's probably making a fan-made game of it at some point. And as we said there, you cannot use somebody else's work or somebody else's IP in your game without getting approval. You can certainly try to make a Mario game if you want and sell it on Sony, but Nintendo will probably stop that long before it happens, especially once they hear about it. Again, copyrightable elements will usually consist, and this is a major part for the Star Control case, of elements that are identifiable to a brand, meaning character designs, aesthetics, music, similar UI or background cues, etc. Those are elements that play a major role, and we'll come back to that point in a few minutes. However, what isn't copyrightable are individual game mechanics and systems. If that was the case, then there would be no other first-person shooter after Wolfenstein 3D, or nobody will be able to make a 2D side-scroller after Super Mario Bros. Individual elements, the nuts and bolts that make up a video game, cannot be copyrighted. If I want to make a game called Super Josh Brothers, that's a 2D platformer, and I use completely original aesthetics, models, and game mechanics, there is no way that you will be able to distinguish that or think that is a part or a derivative part of a Super Mario Bros. Franchise. Now, if I do use aesthetics or similar cues, that's a different story. Now, what makes discussing this kind of case when it comes to cloning games or copying from somebody else is that the court of public opinion plays a major role in this. And we have certainly seen, especially from the mobile and free-to-play side, when gamers will go after a title if they see elements that are just straight up stolen or cloned from a more successful or a more well-known game. Again, I can make an RTS, you can make an RTS, but if we start calling our characters the Berg, Karen, and Sotos, that could be a different story. And speaking about RTSs, that's another really great example. In a live show that we did, we talked about UI design and how more developers need to look at other examples of the genre in order to draw inspiration and base their UIs on. because once a UI has become standardized, it just makes sense for everyone to use it to help cut down the learning curve as well as development of that specific element. But like we said, UI by itself is not copyrightable. So here's the example. Anyone who played an RTS in the 90s and into the early thousands knows of the info pane. That is when, like, from this point down, you have all the stats and stuff that's going on. Maybe the mini-map is over here. It could be over here. You have unit commands. You have, what group you've selected, command or action, special abilities, stuff like that. That UI pane was featured in many RTSs. StarCraft, Rise of Nations, Age of Empires, more than I can remember, Grey Goo as well, Company of Heroes. The reason why that is fine is that individual element is universal. What each developer did was add unique graphical aesthetics or functionality that tweaked or shifted it to being their own. So the Age of Empires UI may have its little logo here. The StarCraft UI, for instance, had 3 different aesthetics dependent on the race that you chose. Rise of Nations, the same thing. Empire Earth featured a picture-in-picture element for its UI. The point is, if you put up a screenshot of Command & Conquer next to a screenshot of StarCraft, nobody's going to say that those two games are exactly the same. They're not going to confuse StarCraft or Command & Conquer and vice versa. But as we're going to switch to some game footage, we're going to talk a little bit more about how things are falling out of Stardock's favor when it comes to Star Control Origins versus Star Control 1 and 2. But before we get to that, quick word to our Patreon supporters. And now a quick shout out to our supporters over on patreon.com/GWBycer. Here we have footage of Star Control 2. And this is definitely the best footage to show for this discussion when it comes to the idea of copyrighting game mechanics. As we said in the last part, individual systems cannot be copyrighted because they cannot be directly attached to an IP. For instance, going back to my Super Josh Brothers example, if I want to include a power-up that lets me throw a fireball at my enemies, that in of itself cannot be tied to Nintendo. However, if I indirectly or directly model that after the Mario Fire Flower, that's a different story. Indirectly would be that I create an item that looks very similar, although different, and it has the same properties or look as the Mario Fireball. Directly would mean that I would literally take this asset, put it in my game, and not change one thing. And most developers are not crazy enough to do that when it comes to these elements. Now, taking this back to the Star Control Origins versus Star Control 2, Paul and Fred put up on their website a chart showing the various elements from Star Control 2 versus Star Control 3 versus Star Control Origins. And that is a very big deal. According to the claim that Paul and Fred filed against Stardock, that when Stardock bought the quote-unquote rights to the Star Control franchise, they only bought 2 specific areas. They bought the name Star Control, and they bought the scenario, characters, and original content for Star Control 3, which most fans choose to forget as that was considered the lesser of the games. It was the one that was not made, I think, with Paul and Fred's specific consent, and that was why it looks different from a UI standpoint. As we just said, individual systems and core gameplay loops cannot be copyrighted. If you want to have a top-down space exploration game, and I want to make a top-down space exploration game, there's nothing wrong there. But if one of those two people start including elements in design that reference or heavily imply that they're part of the other game without having specific IP ownership or licensing, that is a serious problem. And this is why, despite Brad Wardell from Stardock and his fans kind of mocking that chart, they are in some big trouble. Because looking at those elements side by side, you can see how much Star Control Origins is building its look and its structure from Star Control 2, a game and a property that they don't have ownership over. And the big point about using Star Control 3 is that if they were trying to make this on the up and up, they could have based the design on either Star Control 3 itself, using those characters, scenario, and aesthetics, or they would build it off of an entirely original engine or original property and elements to differentiate itself. As we said in the last part, the court of public opinion is a major element when it comes to these kinds of cases. And one of the things that the judge and the lawyers look for is whether or not people can tell that there is a difference. Again, if you put Age of Empires next to, let's say, Rise of Nations, yes, they're both quote-unquote historical real-time strategy games, but the look, design, and UI elements are different enough that you can tell those games apart. If somebody who has never played Star Control 2 or Origins looks at the screenshots and the chart that Paul and Fred put up, and they say, yes, Origins looks just like Star Control 2, that is very much damning against Stardock. Because again, they don't have any claim to Star Control 2. And if people look at this as being a derivative work from that franchise, it means that Stardock is violating copyright. And if that's the case, it means that Origins is not going to be able to hold up like this. And to begin to wrap things up, so for people watching this right now, if you're working on a platformer, you don't have to worry about Nintendo coming after you. Just as if you want to make a first-person shooter, its lawyers aren't going to be knocking at your door. Again, individual mechanics, systems, and gameplay loops cannot be copyrighted in the court of law or by law. But elements that tie these systems to specific IPs and brands is another story. The 3D platformer genre is the perfect example. Just about every 3D platformer released from the mid-90s into the thousands had the same structure. You have a hub, you have these individual worlds, you have a MacGuffin to collect. But each one of those games featured a different aesthetic and a different branding around those elements. You're not going to confuse Banjo and Kazooie for Super Mario 64 or Crash Bandicoot with Spyro the Dragon. And because of that, those games held up because you cannot, again, copy those elements, those individual elements. If, for instance, let's say Sony decided to make a 3D platformer and featured Power Stars, or, for some stupid reason had Mario in it, that would be a far different story. But again, as long as you create enough original elements that you define your own brand, and specifically one that you own, then you're in the clear. But with that said, we're going to wrap things up for today's Industry Insight. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you'd like to check out our Patreon and my first book, as well as our Discord channel open to all, you'll find that link down below. But come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. If you're looking for another book about game design, be sure to check out my first title, 20 Essential Games to Study, out now. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.